we're going to revisit tension because I got some good feedback on that, and I think that it's something people are interested in. It's something that draws in the reader and keeps the reader reading. So we're going to be talking about starting your tension in your book. Welcome to How to Write Good. I am your host, Daniel Poppie. You can find out more about me at danielpoppie.com. If it is your first time here, How to Write Good is a writing podcast that seeks to find principles and advice that can be applied across a broad range of writing situations. If you've been here before, don't forget to subscribe, hit that like button below, and share. So if you can't remember, I've talked about tension before. And just to give you a quick recap, I was talking about what is at the center of tension. What is happening when we're developing tension in our story? And what I said before is that tension is creating a question within the mind of the reader. And I think that this question is something that grows and grows and grows in the mind of the reader the whole entire time the reader is reading. And then when we have the climax of the story, that is when the tension breaks. That question is answered, the reader feels the tension release, and they say, oh, that's what happens. Okay, I get it. That's how everything makes sense. That is what happens to the character. That is what happens to the question I've been asking. And there are many different questions that are asked within stories. Does the guy get the girl? Does the hero win the fight? Does the person overcome their emotional difficulties? There's so many different questions you can ask. And I would encourage you to figure out what that question is within your story and focus the central part of your story on that question so that you can build that tension up to the climax of your story until you answer whether that question is going one way or another way. Now, I wanted to talk about tension again, but I wanted to focus on starting tension because some people might be thinking, yeah, so tension is a question I'm putting in the reader's mind, and I understand that, and I understand things that can happen within the story, but how do I start tension within my story in a way that is subtle? How do I start tension in a way that the reader doesn't even notice, or that it's actually hard to find when you analyze the literature? Because when we have tension in our story, or when we're able to create tension immediately, or we create tension very subtly, we can bring that reader into our story and the main conflict in a way that is smooth. I think that's the best way to say it. We can bring them into the main conflict in a nice, buttery way. Now, I just want to say something because I just said that we're going to use that little bit of tension to bring the reader into the main conflict. But when we introduce that little bit of tension into our story, we might be introducing a piece of the main conflict, so we are starting the main conflict in the story, or we might be introducing a side thing within the story. So we can do both. But the goal of this initial tension is to pique the reader's interest, to make the reader think, what is going to happen to this character? And it's often the case within stories that we don't know what's happening to the character until later on in the story. We don't know what the big question is that we're going to ask. And in some stories, we don't actually know who the character's enemy is or the antagonist is until far later in the story. So we know there's something happening, but we really don't know what that character is facing, and this often happens in mysteries or thrillers. But I just wanted to make that note of this idea that the tension we're creating initially can be the main conflict, but it also can be something that either feeds into the main conflict later, or it's something that'll happen on the outside of the story. It's a side story that's going on. I would suggest that you generally start the tension using the main conflict in some sense because it'll make more sense to the reader. But again, going back to what I said before, if you can make it work, if you can make it work well, I think that you should be able to try it at the very least. So how do we start this tension? That's where we're trying to get. Well, It's a very basic thing, and it can be applied across many different types of stories. How you would create tension in your story is by creating a problem for a character. It might be the main character, or it might be another one of the characters, but that is how you can start the tension. The first way I would say is the one I talked about before that people usually try to avoid. It's what I call, I've got a big face and a loud mouth. It's like Bowser capturing Princess Peach in Mario. I was going to say Zelda. It's like Bowser capturing Princess Peach in Mario. We immediately know what the issue is. We immediately know the goal of the main character. And we have this question in our mind of whether the main character is going to succeed or fail. The second way in which we can place this question in the reader's mind is what I like to call, I whisper everything and I'm hard to understand. And it's just for you to remember what it is. So what I mean by that is we are not presenting something big and obvious to the reader. We're presenting something very small. And it's something that the reader can look back at and they can see that the tension was started there. This can take a lot of different forms. So for example, let's just take the Mario situation again. Instead of Bowser capturing Princess Peach, Mario might get a note in the mail that's a very cryptic note. It doesn't tell us exactly what is happening, but it does key us in that something is happening. So first off, we have a question in our mind, what's going on? We could also do this in another way. Mario could go visit Peach and he could find her not at home. And he thinks to himself, that doesn't really make sense. Why isn't she at home? And then he rationalizes why she isn't at home and he goes on about his day. And then we slowly find out that she has been captured. That initial point where he sees that she isn't at home and he thinks to himself, well, why isn't she at home? That doesn't make any sense, is when the tension starts in the story. A character losing something can be very useful because the reader wants the character to find the thing he lost, and it puts that question of where did it go in the reader's mind, and it forces the character to go and do something, that thing being finding what they lost. And it can lead to the building up of tension and adding more things on to that tension within the story. So when you think about applying this is what I think you should do. I think this would work the best if you're just starting out or you're just thinking about how this will work in your own story. Think about a bigger way in which you can put tension into the story. Think about that bigger way in which you can introduce the conflict. And then think smaller. Think about a piece of that bigger way. And then think even smaller than that. And think about the smallest possible thing that you can use from that larger piece to create tension within your story. And I think that's how you introduce tension in a very subtle way. Another side note on this is you actually can create tension from the moment you start the story. You can create tension with a lot of different things. You can create tension with the first line or even the first word. The way in which you do this is the same philosophy I was talking about before. It's the same strategy I was talking about before where you're only presenting part of it. For example, if I started a story saying, Fred wasn't a mean person, but I didn't like him anyway, what is going on in your head suddenly is the question, why is Fred a mean person? Why don't you like him? You already have that question in the mind of your readers, and the readers continually want to know, why is Fred not a mean person, but you dislike him anyway? And I applied this same strategy of taking one little part of the story and presenting it to the reader and not telling them anything else. So I'd love to hear your other ways that you start tension in your story, and I'd love to hear your feedback on whether this will work for you or why do you think it won't work for you. If you enjoyed this podcast and you want to support me, there's really one simple thing you can do. You can go to danielpoppie.com/newsletter and sign up for my newsletter. And when you sign up, you'll actually be able to get access to my publication roadmap. So that's everything I have planned for pretty much every project I have into the next decade. Again, that is danielpoppie.com/newsletter. You can also find the link below.